let's go back to Purim times. Once again, another war with Amalek. It says in the pasuk that part of the decree, Haman's first decree with Achashverosh, was that their Jews' possessions shall be for the spoil. That is, they get to kill the Jews and they get to take all their possessions, which is kind of good. That's what they originally decreed. So the response from Achashverosh was he can't annul that decree. He could just write that, give the Jews permission to preemptively strike their own enemies, rise up and strike their own enemies, and also ushlalam lavos, and the Jews could take their enemies' property after they dispose of them. Except it says a few times afterwards there were three battles. There was the day that the battle was supposed to happen. That was the 13th of Adar. Okay, and that was a day of battle in both Shushan and around the Persian Empire. Esther asked Achashverosh also for a dispensation to continue the war in Shushan another day. So there was Shushan day 1, Shushan day 2, and around the world just one day. And it says concerning all of those engagements, Vabiza lo shalahu eth yadam, and they did not send forth their hand upon the spoils. That means they didn't take any spoils, any of the booty from their enemies, even though the royal decree had allowed them to do so. So here's the question. Rashi brings us up right there in the 8th parak when you see that this new declaration on behalf of the Jewish people was promulgated. It says, Ushlalom Lavos, Rashi says, Kasher dichtav rishonoth. The Jews were given permission to despoil their enemies because that's what their enemies had permission to do to them. Behaim, but for them, Babizah lo shalahu with yadam. You read a few psukim later, 3 times it says they did not take any of the spoils. Sheharu lakol shelo na'asa l'shem mamon. By doing so, the Jewish people showed that their whole interest was to defend themselves. They weren't doing it for the sake of money. Okay, that's why they didn't take any spoils. They could have, but they didn't. That's quite selfless of them. But this Rashi is actually, by the way, there's nothing in the Targum that I found about this. I didn't find anything in Gemara about this. Someone could find a classic midrash or Gemara about this, that would be very enlightening, and I'd be very appreciative. Right when it says that the Jews didn't take any spoils, it says Vabizalo shaluch with yadam. This is more telling. He says Shelo yitain Amalek ayin tzara b'mamon. The Jews didn't take any of the spoils because they didn't want Achashverosh to place it says a stingy eye. What's ayin tzara? That means a person doesn't want to give to others. Stinginess. So they're afraid that Achashverosh would suddenly become a little bit jealous of this. Achashverosh would say, I want some of that money myself. So they're like, oh, maybe these Jews weren't actually so much in danger. They're just trying to enrich themselves. But it's important that Rashi mentions the king over here. Part of the deficiency of the Purim miracle, the sages wonder about this in the Talmud. They ask, why is it, we don't celebrate Purim with, let's say, the reading of traditional Hallel, Hallel Mitzri, like we do on Hanukkah. And the Gemara answers, Dain Avde da Hashverosh Anon. Okay? Akati Avde da Hashverosh Anon. We're still subjects of Achashverosh. What does that mean? It was an incomplete redemption because this did not lead necessarily to the ingathering of the exiles. This is at a time where the exiles had already been allowed back to the land of Israel after the Cyrus's proclamation and the beginning of the building of the second temple, although it was Achashverosh himself, as mentioned explicitly in other books of the Bible, who authorized the enemies to stop the Jewish people from rebuilding the temple. It was sort of his fault because the buck stops here. He's the one at the one who has all the power to decide. The one who is at the top of the chain, the totem pole. It's really everything is his fault. So we see that they weren't actually holding themselves to some sort of higher standard of ethics. Nowadays, for example, you'd see if our soldiers were to take spoils, God willing, they should be granted a tremendous victory speedily and soon. Suddenly people are saying, among other things, that not everything they do is a war crime, and also taking spoils, that was also bad. That's not why. They were doing it not because there is such an idea that the Jews should try to be machmir in war. Maybe they shouldn't take spoils. It's a higher standard. No, they're just afraid of Achashverosh, that it's good enough that he allowed them to strike at their enemies and destroy them and defend themselves, and they could live. They didn't need to start enriching themselves just to get Achashverosh to second guess or regret what he had done, or perhaps even to then turn force against them in order to seize some of this property. That's a very important point that needs to be made.